the paint smell hit me the moment I opened my front door. Sharp and sweet and completely wrong for a Saturday morning, when I had specifically planned to sleep until noon and eat cereal in my underwear while watching competitive baking shows. Instead, I was standing in the doorway of my own apartment in socks that didn't match, staring at Eric Walker, who had somehow acquired a ladder, 3 cans of pale yellow paint, and what appeared to be a string of cloud-shaped fairy lights, all of which were propped against the wall of the hallway outside my door, like he had been setting up a construction zone without my knowledge or consent. "What?" I said, just the one word. It felt sufficient. Eric looked up from the hardware store bag he was rifling through, completely unbothered. His dark hair pushed back from his forehead with one of those elastic headbands he pretended he only wore when painting, but I was pretty sure he wore around his apartment alone because it suited him annoyingly well. "Morning," he said. "You have terrible taste in welcome mats, by the way." I looked down at my welcome mat. It said "Wipe your paws" and had a cartoon dog on it. I had purchased it at 2 in the morning during a particularly vulnerable online shopping session, and I still stood by it. "You have a ladder," I said. "Observational skills are sharp this early. It's 8:47. "I know. I've been here since 7. I needed to measure the room before you woke up and started hovering." Something cold moved through my chest, not unpleasant exactly, just startling the way cold things always are. Because there was only one room in my apartment that Eric could possibly want to measure at 7 in the morning with a ladder and pale yellow paint and cloud lights. And that room was the one I hadn't been able to open the door to in 4 months. The one that still had flat-packed furniture stacked against the far wall and an unopened box of receiving blankets on the floor and dust collecting on everything because I couldn't go in there. I just could not. "Eric," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I intended. He straightened up and looked at me then. Really looked, the way he did sometimes that made me feel like he was reading something printed on the inside of my ribcage. "I'm going to paint the nursery," he said. "You're going to drink the coffee I left on your kitchen counter and eat the breakfast sandwiches I picked up on my way over, and then, if you want, you can come watch, or you can stay on the couch." Either way, I wanted to argue. I had a whole architecture of arguments ready. That the room was fine, that I was fine, that he didn't need to do this, that he was overstepping, that we were just friends, and friends didn't rearrange the geography of your grief without asking first. I had the arguments all lined up like carefully painted soldiers. Instead, I stepped back and let him in. That was how it always went with Eric Walker. I had known him for 6 years, which was long enough to know that he communicated primarily through action rather than language. He was not a man who said things. He was a man who showed up at 8:47 with a ladder. He was a man who left soup on your doorstep when you had the flu without texting to say he was there. He was a man who remembered without you ever telling him that you took your coffee with exactly 1.5 sugars and an embarrassing amount of oat milk, and who silently adjusted the coffee he handed you until it was right. Words, for Eric, seemed to exist as a formality rather than a primary mode of connection. He used them when necessary. He said please and thank you, and he asked thoughtful questions at the right moments. But the things that mattered, the actual communication of the things that lived under his sternum, those came through his hands and his presence and his quiet, stubborn attention to the details of my life that I had never directly handed him. I, on the other hand, was a person made almost entirely of words. I wrote them for a living, technical writing for a healthcare software company that paid well and demanded a kind of precise, clear language that I appreciated the way some people appreciate minimalist architecture, beautiful in its reduction to essential meaning. And in my personal life, words were how I processed, how I expressed, how I built the structures that kept me functional. I narrated my own experience constantly, inside my head and sometimes out loud, and I believed, possibly too firmly, that if something could be named and articulated, it could be survived. The problem was that the thing between Eric and me had no name I was willing to say out loud. It had been 6 years of him and me, and the specific gravity we seemed to exert on each other. 6 years of his number at the top of my recent calls, and my name, apparently, at the top of his. because he picked up on the first ring every time, regardless of the hour. 6 years of him knowing when something was wrong before I said anything, and of me knowing the particular set of his shoulders that meant he was exhausted but wouldn't admit it. And of us existing in the same spaces with a naturalness that I had stopped questioning and started taking for granted the way you take for granted the fact that the sun will rise. We had never defined it, I told myself. It was because we were men who had both come of age in environments where love between men was not spoken of naturally or freely, and that we had both carried the habits of discretion long past the point where discretion was necessary. I told myself a lot of things. The truth, which I was aware of but managing carefully, was that I was afraid. I was afraid that naming it would change it, that pressing on the soft underbelly of what we were would reveal either that it was less than what I felt, or that it was exactly what I felt, and that reality would then require me to live in it fully exposed without the comfortable ambiguity of 6 years as my shelter. And then Marcus had happened. Marcus Elliott was not a bad person. I want to be clear about that, in the way I tend to want clarity about things, in the way I feel compelled to be fair even when fairness costs me something. He was warm and attentive, and he had a good laugh, and he asked me questions about my work, like he actually wanted to understand it, not just as conversational filler. When he looked at me in those first few months, I felt seen in the most straightforward way, like stepping into a beam of light, uncomplicated warmth, no shadows required. I had met him at a mutual friend's birthday gathering, and he had handed me a drink I hadn't asked for, but turned out to be exactly what I wanted, and I had thought, somewhat desperately, maybe this is what simple feels like. Maybe I should choose simple. Maybe the complicated, unnamed 6-year orbit around Eric Walker was a thing I had been using as a reason not to move forward, not to risk, not to let anyone else in. So I let Marcus in. And it had been good. It really had. For 18 months, it was genuinely good. Easy in the way that things are easy when both people are trying hard and the trying hasn't yet started to feel like labor. We traveled a little. We cooked bad meals that tasted good because we were laughing. We built the kind of ordinary life that looks like happiness from the outside and, for a while, felt like it from the inside too. And then I found out about the baby. Not Marcus's baby, mine. Or rather, ours. The child we had talked about, planned for, decided on together with the careful seriousness of two people who believed they were building something lasting. We had gone through the entire process with a surrogate, the kind of process that requires paperwork and hope, and the particular bravery of wanting something so much you're willing to document it in triplicate. And at the end of it, there was going to be a child. Our child. A daughter. We named her early, the way you do when hope outpaces caution. We named her Lily. And then Marcus left. Not because of the baby, not exactly. Or maybe because of the baby in the way that big things have a way of revealing the smaller truths that have been accumulating under the surface for a long time. He said he wasn't ready. He said he thought he was, but he wasn't. He said he loved me, but he said a lot of things which in hindsight I should have respected more because at least he used words and I had always believed in words. And here they were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, communicating the shape of something real even when the shape was devastating. He left. And then, 11 days later, the surrogate lost the baby, Lily. I am not going to linger here in this particular room of the story because the grief that came afterward was of the kind that doesn't sharpen into something narratable for a long time. It was just weight. Enormous, undifferentiated weight. The kind that makes the morning feel like an act of resistance and the evening feel like defeat. I carried it around my apartment and I did my job, and I answered my phone with something that sounded enough like a normal voice that most people didn't press on it. And I kept the door to the nursery closed. Eric pressed on it, not with words, with soup and sandwiches and sitting on my couch watching television with me in silence until midnight, with checking in through texts that never required responses but always felt like a hand on my shoulder, with being, simply and consistently, present in a way that I understood to be the most expensive thing he knew how to offer. And now, on a Saturday morning that smelled like paint, he was here to do the thing I couldn't do myself, The coffee was perfect, of course it was. I sat at my kitchen table and drank it, and ate the breakfast sandwich he'd brought, which had eggs and sharp cheese and something herbed that shouldn't have worked but did. And I listened to the sounds coming from down the hall, the scrape of furniture being carefully moved, the click of a paint can being pried open, the particular silence of someone working alone with focus. After an hour, I got up. I stood outside the nursery door for a moment, my hand on the frame, and then I pushed it open. The room smelled like possibility and paint. Eric had moved the flat-packed furniture to one side and spread a drop cloth across the floor, and one wall was already half covered in that soft, warm yellow. Not bright, not nursery yellow in the cliched sense, but something more like the inside of a morning, pale and gentle and full of something that hadn't happened yet. He was on the ladder, edging carefully along the ceiling line, and he didn't stop when I came in. He just said, without turning around, "There's a roller on the floor if you want to do the low sections." I picked up the roller. We didn't talk much. That was the thing about Eric. Silence with him was never empty. It had texture, like the good kind of fabric, something you could rest your weight on without falling through. We painted the walls, while the morning turned to afternoon, and at some point he put on music from his phone. The kind of playlist that suggested he had actually thought about what would feel right for this specific task. Nothing too heavy, nothing too light, just melody doing its work in the background. "Where did you find the lights?" I asked. "Somewhere around the second wall." "Online, 3 nights ago. I couldn't sleep." I looked at the string of cloud-shaped lights sitting in their packaging by the window. 3 nights ago had been a Wednesday, which meant he'd been thinking about this room while I was lying in my own bed not sleeping, which was what I did most nights. Lying there in the dark thinking about what I had lost and what I might never have, and whether the grief was a season or a permanent address. "You should have told me," I said. "You would have said, 'Don't bother.'" He was not wrong. "Eric." "Eric. You don't have to, Jimmy." He turned to look at me from the ladder paintbrush in hand, and there was something in his face that I rarely saw in him, not quite impatience, more like the particular tiredness of a person who has been carrying a weight quietly for a long time and is choosing in this moment not to pretend it isn't heavy. "Let me do this." 3 words. Let me do this. And something in those 3 words was not about paint. I turned back to the wall and kept rolling. Here is what I knew about Eric Walker by the time I was 29 and he was 31. He had grown up moving between different places following a father whose work required relocation every few years, and the result was a person who had learned to build home out of portable things. Habits, routines. The particular way he arranged the objects on whatever kitchen counter he happened to be living beside. He carried his sense of order with him like a turtle carries its shell, and it showed in everything from the way he organized his bookshelf to the way he approached problems. Methodically, patiently, building from the ground up. He was an architect. Of course he was. A man who built things, literally, for a living, who had a particular gift for understanding space and what people needed from it, for reading the emotional requirements of a room and designing accordingly. He worked at a small firm that specialized in residential projects. Not the flashy commercial stuff, but the deeply personal work of making the places where people actually lived feel like the places they wanted to be. His clients loved him because he listened in the particular way of someone who is gathering information rather than waiting for their turn to speak. He had never been in a long relationship. That I knew of. There had been people over the 6 years I'd known him. A man named Daniel for about 8 months when we were 26, and someone else briefly after that. Names I had collected with the careful casualness of a person trying not to reveal how much he was cataloging. But nothing that lasted, nothing that deepened into the kind of partnership that reshapes the geography of your life. I had told myself it was because he was private, because he didn't talk about personal things easily, because the architecture of his interior life had the same quality as his buildings. Purposeful, beautiful in its structure, not designed for public entry. I had not allowed myself, for 6 years, to wonder if I was a reason. After the nursery, I started wondering, and once I started, I couldn't stop. The evidence was everywhere, arranged in my memory with the patience of a case file I hadn't known I was building. The night we'd spent talking until 4 in the morning about whether regret or anticipation was more exhausting, and how he looked at me when I finally stopped talking like I had said something he'd been needing to hear someone say out loud. The way he'd rearranged his entire Saturday without complaint, the time I'd locked myself out of my car and was stranded 40 minutes from home in the rain, the small habitual gestures. The way he turned toward me in a group of people when someone said something funny, not to share the joke, but to see my reaction to it. As though my face was the more interesting text. The time he'd read an entire book about grief, quietly and without telling me, so that he would understand better what I was going through. I only found out because I found the book on his coffee table with his reading glasses folded inside it as a bookmark, and when I picked it up, he looked briefly caught, then settled. "Research," he said. "Into grief?" "Into yours," he said simply, and then changed the subject. I had filed it. I had filed all of it, told myself it was just the nature of him, just the particular language of a private person who expressed care differently than most, and left it there in the neat folders of things I was not examining. But the nursery had unlocked something. The nursery had been too specific, too large, too much the kind of thing that a person does for someone they love in a way that exceeds every reasonable definition of friendship. The room took 3 days to finish. Eric came back the next morning with more supplies. A set of wooden shelving brackets he'd clearly cut and finished himself, smooth and clean, and the right color to go with the yellow walls. He'd brought a mobile he'd found somewhere, white stars and crescent moons on slender threads, the kind that would turn slowly in a breeze from the window. He'd brought a soft rug in cream and gray that anchored the space. On the third day, we assembled the crib together. I don't think either of us said more than 40 words during the assembly. The instructions were clear enough. We passed tools back and forth with the easy choreography of two people who have moved around each other long enough to know where the other person's hands are going to be. And when the crib was finished standing solid and clean in the corner under the window where the morning light came in gentle and unhurried, I sat down on the floor next to it and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes. I didn't cry. Or maybe I did, a little. The kind of crying that isn't dramatic, just a release of pressure, like something sealed too tight, finally exhaling. Eric sat down next to me on the floor. Not across from me, not at a respectful distance, but right next to me, so his shoulder was against mine, warm and solid. We sat like that for a long time. "I don't know what to do with it," I said eventually. My voice came out rough. "The room, I don't know if I should leave it or I don't know if I'm going to, if I'll ever." "You don't have to decide today." "I know. I stopped and tried again. It felt wrong to have it empty, and it feels strange to have it ready. I don't know where the right place is." "There isn't one," Eric said. "That's not how grief works. There's just where you are today, and tomorrow is different." I turned to look at him. He was staring at the crib, his profile quiet and focused, like he was reading the room the way he read his architectural plans, looking for the logic in the structure, the intention behind the form. "When did you get wise?" "I've always been wise, you just weren't paying attention." That startled a sound out of me that was almost a laugh, and I felt something loosen in my chest, not break, but give a little. The way a muscle releases when you've been holding tension so long you forgot it was tension. "Thank you," I said, "for the room, for all of this." He didn't say "you're welcome." He said, "Of course," in the voice he used when something was so fundamentally obvious to him that articulating it felt almost absurd, like thanking the sun for rising. And that was the moment, if I'm being precise about it, that was the moment I knew I had been managing something that was no longer manageable. The 6-year, careful distance, the deliberate ambiguity, the practiced equilibrium of a friendship that had always been more than that, but that I had refused to name for reasons that now felt more like cowardice than caution. All of it shifted in that quiet room. On that floor with his shoulder against mine and a crib assembled in the corner. I was in love with Eric Walker. I had probably always been in love with Eric Walker, and I had absolutely no idea what to do about it. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with 0 ads or get access to exclusive videos, Our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. I went home, which was already my home. I went back to the rest of my apartment, and I sat with the knowledge for several days, like a person sitting with a piece of news so large they haven't yet worked out how to file it. The thing about realizing you're in love with your best friend 6 years in is that there is no clean place to put the information. It doesn't slot neatly into the existing structure. It's more like discovering that the building you've been living in comfortably for years has a whole additional floor that you somehow never noticed. And you're not sure whether climbing those stairs is a beginning or an ending. I called my friend Dara, who had known both me and Eric for years, and who had been not so subtly implying things about us for most of that time, with the particular confidence of someone who has made up their mind and is simply waiting for the other parties to catch up. Finally, she said, before I'd finished the sentence, "Excuse me? You're going to tell me you're in love with Eric. Please tell me that's what you're calling to say, because I have been waiting for this call for literally 4 years. I was going to ask how you were." "I'm great. I'm fantastic. I've been right about you two since the night of Marco's birthday party when you spent the entire evening watching Eric across the room like he was a documentary you needed to understand." "Jimmy, finally. This is not helpful. This is extremely helpful. This is the most helpful I have ever been. What are you going to do?" That was the question. What was I going to do? Because the obvious answer, tell him. Use the words I was supposedly so good at. Form a sentence beginning with I and ending with you and containing the relevant verb in the middle was also the terrifying answer. The answer that required risking the thing. I already had the warmth and solidity and presence of a person who had sat on my floor for an hour without needing to say anything, who had painted my daughter's nursery, who had left soup outside my door in the dark. "I don't know," I admitted. "You're going to have to tell him," Dara said. "Not because it'll definitely work out, but because you can't keep carrying this and pretending you're carrying something lighter. You know that." She was right. She was annoying, and she was right. "What if it changes things?" I said. "What if I say it and it?" "Changes what things, Jimmy? The things where he shows up with a ladder at 7 in the morning. The things where he knows exactly how you take your coffee. The things where you two sit in the same room doing separate work for 4 hours and apparently consider that a lovely afternoon. Those things? When you say it like that, when I say it accurately, Dara, Jimmy." She exhaled, and her voice softened into something less arch, more genuine. "Listen, I've watched you two for years, and what I see is not ambiguity. What I see is two people who are deeply in love and who have both been so afraid of what they might lose that they haven't let themselves have what's already there. And I think you know that. I think you've known it for a long time." The quiet on my end of the phone lasted long enough that I could hear her breathing. "The nursery scared me," I admitted. "Not in a bad way, in the way where something true is so close to you that you can finally see it clearly." "Then you already have your answer," she said. "You just have to say it." She hung up, because Dara believed in exits as much as entrances, and I sat with her words arranged around me like furniture in a room I was deciding whether to move into. The week after the nursery was completed, Eric started coming over more. Not that he hadn't come over regularly before. He had, with the easy frequency of someone who knew he was welcome, who had long since stopped knocking with any real ceremony. But there was a shift in the visits, something in their quality that I kept noticing without being able to fully articulate. He stayed later. He brought food more often, not just sandwiches, but actual meals, the kind that suggested planning. A pasta dish he'd made at his apartment and transported in a container with a lid he clearly owned specifically for this purpose. A soup again, but different. A rich golden one, this time with herbs I couldn't name but could taste. Once a whole roasted chicken that he'd wrapped in foil and carried up 3 flights of stairs like it was a completely ordinary thing to do. He fixed things. My kitchen faucet had been doing a slow, mournful drip for 2 months, and one evening I came out of the shower to find him under the sink with his sleeves rolled up, fixing it without commentary or ceremony. A cabinet door that didn't close properly became properly closing. A light fixture in the hallway that I'd been meaning to replace was replaced. He also did quieter things. He reorganized my bookshelf one afternoon while I was on a call. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but I came back to find that the books that I'd been looking for every week, because I could never remember where they'd ended up, were now arranged in a way that made immediate natural sense. The kind of organizational logic you feel rather than see. He left notes sometimes, not elaborate ones, just small indicators that he'd been thinking of me. A link to an article he thought I'd find interesting, texted with no comment because the article was the comment. A particular brand of tea I had mentioned once, 5 months ago, appearing in my cabinet because he'd been in the store and remembered. He fixed things, the physical things and the others. None of it was announced. None of it was presented as an act of generosity or care that required acknowledgement. He just did the things that needed doing, in the quiet, purposeful way of a person for whom love had always been a verb rather than a noun. And I watched him, and I ached with it. I watched him sit at my kitchen table with his reading glasses on, going through something on his laptop while I worked at the other end. And the domestic comfort of it was almost physically painful. The intimacy of two people occupying the same space with their ordinary lives, the profound ordinariness of it, the thing I had apparently been starving for without knowing the name of what I was hungry for. One evening, about 10 days after the nursery, he was on my couch reading while I cooked. I had insisted on cooking, had presented this as a non-negotiable position after he'd fed me for the better part of a month, and the light was doing the evening thing where it turns everything warm and slightly golden. And he had his glasses on and his feet up, and there was a paperback folded open across his chest while he read, and I had to set down the spoon I was holding and breathe for a moment. "You okay?" he asked, without looking up. "Yup," I said. "You stopped stirring." Thinking. About what? Tell him. The voice in my head was very clear. Dara's voice. And underneath it, something older and quieter, my own voice that I'd been arguing with for 6 years. Tell him now, while the light is like this, and he's on your couch with his glasses on and his feet up. And you absolutely know, that this is not how most people treat their friends. Instead, I said, whether I put enough garlic in this. "You always put enough garlic in things," he said. "You have a naturally accurate garlic hand." That is genuinely the nicest thing anyone has said to me in months. He smiled without looking up from his book. "Your bar is low. You said it so." He did look up at that over the tops of his glasses, which was frankly an unfair thing for him to do because Eric Walker looked at me over the tops of his reading glasses, and I had to actually press my hand flat against the counter to stay upright. "Was that an insult?" he asked. "It was an observation," I said, "purely descriptive." He held my gaze for a moment. That particular way of his reading something in me that I hadn't said, and then he went back to his book without answering, which was also an unfair thing to do. But that was the nature of Eric. He got in the last word by not using any. The conversation that changed things was not the grand one I had been preparing. It happened on a Wednesday night when we had both been sitting on my couch for an hour, watching a nature documentary about migratory birds that neither of us had particularly chosen, but neither of us had changed, because it turned out the footage was genuinely beautiful and the narrator had a voice like slowly poured honey. The birds were doing something extraordinary over a body of water, thousands of them moving and shifting formations that looked impossible, the kind of coordinated complexity that defies easy explanation. "How do they know?" I said. Not really a question to him, more thinking out loud. "How does each individual bird know where to move?" "They respond to the birds directly around them," Eric said. "Not to the whole flock, just the immediate neighbors. The pattern emerges from that." I turned to look at him. "How do you know that?" "I read things," he said. "You act like this is surprising." "I'm not surprised, I'm just—" I stopped. And then, because the light was doing the thing again, and the birds were doing the impossible thing on the screen, and I was apparently done being someone who managed things carefully instead of saying them, I said, "You read things so you can tell them to me." He went still. Not the natural stillness of someone at rest, the stillness of someone who has been asked a question they weren't expecting, who is processing whether to answer it honestly. "Sometimes," he said, "Eric, Jimmy, can I ask you something?" He set the remote control down on the cushion between us. "You can always ask me things. Why did you do the nursery?" He was quiet for long enough that the documentary filled the silence with the narrator explaining the physics of murmuration, which felt fitting in a way I could have done without. "Because you needed it done," he said, finally. "That's not," I started. "And because I couldn't do nothing," he said. Quieter this time. Lower, like it was coming from somewhere he didn't usually speak from. I'm not good at, I couldn't fix what happened." "And I can't." He stopped. His jaw tightened slightly, the way it did when he was working around something difficult. "I can't always say what I want to say, so I do things instead. You know that." "I know that," I said softly. The nursery was. He picked up his own hands and looked at them for a moment, which was a thing I'd seen him do before when he was trying to find the words. Like the blueprints for what he needed to build were written in his palms. It was the clearest thing I could think of. Something that needed to happen that you couldn't do alone. "You're always doing things," I said. "The soup, the fixing things, the food, all of it. That's been 6 years of that, Eric." He looked at me. "Yes," he said. "Why?" The documentary continued. The birds wheeled and turned, impossibly beautiful, each one responding only to its nearest neighbor while the shape of the whole became something that no single bird had planned. "I think you know why," Eric said. "I need you to say it," I said. And then, more honestly, "Or I can say mine first, if that's easier." Something moved across his face, something I could only call relief. The specific easing of a person who has been holding themselves at a particular kind of tension for so long that the prospect of putting it down is almost disorienting. "You can say yours," he said quietly. So I did. "I'm in love with you," I said. "I've probably been in love with you for most of the 6 years I've known you." And I was afraid to say it because I was afraid of what it would cost if I was wrong about what this is. But I'm more afraid now of keeping it to myself because I stopped and then finished honestly, because the nursery, Eric. Because of what your hands have been saying for 6 years while you couldn't find the words. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the fullest silence I'd ever been in, thick with something that had been growing in the dark for years and had just, finally, been brought into the light. Eric reached over and took my hand. He didn't say, "I love you." Not in those words, not then. He turned my hand over in both of his, the way he sometimes examined a detail in a building he was designing, with the careful attention of someone who knows the importance of understanding a thing completely before committing it to permanence. And then he pressed his mouth to the inside of my wrist, once, quiet and deliberate, and that was his answer. The thing about loving someone you've been friends with for 6 years is that there is no beginning. You can't trace back to the first time you saw them because you've already been seeing them for so long that the origin point has become archaeology rather than memory. The story doesn't start the way love stories are supposed to start. It just continues into a new shape. What changed was everything and nothing. He still came over with food. He still fixed things without announcing he was going to fix them. He still sat at the other end of my kitchen table while I worked and read things so he could tell them to me later. He still knew how I took my coffee, but now when he handed it to me, his fingers stayed on the cup a beat longer until mine covered his. And when he sat next to me on the couch, the careful, maintained distance of 6 years had dissolved into something closer, his arm around me. My head finding the particular place at the curve of his shoulder that seemed in some obscure physical law to have been the exact shape it was, in order to accommodate exactly me. He started saying my name differently. Or maybe he always had, and I was only now allowed to notice it. Jimmy, with a kind of weight on it, like the name meant something specific to him, like it was shorthand for a much longer sentence he was still finding the words for. And I, who had always believed in words, discovered that there was a kind of language I had been fluent in all along without knowing it, the language of proximity of attention, of someone looking up from what they're doing, not because they need to, but because you walked into the room. We did not rush. This, I think, was the great gift of loving someone you already knew. There was no urgency born from uncertainty, no desperate gathering of data to figure out who the other person really was. We already knew. We had 6 years of knowing. What we were doing now was not discovery, but translation, taking what we already understood and finding its right expression. We had our first real kiss. Not the press of mouth to wrist which I counted, which absolutely counted, but the first one that was unambiguously a kiss, happened in my kitchen on a Thursday evening when he was drying dishes. I had washed and I turned around and he was right there, closer than I had accounted for. And I just looked at him for a moment with my hands still damp and the light coming through the window in its golden evening way, and then there was no question. He kissed the way he did everything else, careful, deliberate, with complete attention, not rushed, not performing anything, just present, the way he was always present, with a quality of focused calm that made me feel, for the first time in months, like I was in exactly the right place. I thought, afterward, that I should feel more surprised. 6 years of managing this thing, of keeping it at a distance, and now it was here in the kitchen with dish soap on my hands. And it felt not like an arrival but like a recognition, the particular relief of something that has been true for a very long time finally being acknowledged by everyone in the room. "Okay," I said when we broke apart. "Okay," he agreed with the quietest version of his smile, the one he only used when something surprised him into happiness. "I feel like I should say something more significant than okay," I said. "Okay is sufficient," he said. 6 years, I said. "I know. I'm just noting, for the record." "Noted," he said, and turned back to drying the dishes, but he reached over without looking and found my hand and kept it, damp and all, while he finished with the other one. That was us. Ordinary and extraordinary in the same breath, the same motion, the same evening. I want to tell you about the months that followed, because I think they matter, because I think the love story that happens after the beginning is often the more interesting one, the one that requires more of you. That shows you what you're actually capable of. We were learning each other differently. We knew each other's habits and histories and the particular topography of each other's silences, but we were learning the closer language, what he needed when he was overwhelmed by work, quiet proximity. Not to be asked how he was doing, what I needed when the grief came back, to be allowed to feel it without someone trying to fix it, just to be sat with in the way he had always sat with me. The grief did come back. That's the true thing about grief. It doesn't resolve on a schedule, doesn't complete and file itself away because your life has moved to a better place. Lily was still there, in the nursery with its yellow walls and its cloud lights, in the crib that Eric had helped me assemble on the floor. Some mornings, I would open the door and just stand in the doorway and let myself feel it, the shape of what was lost, the extraordinary specificity of a particular loss, a particular name. Eric learned to let me stand there. He learned not to come to the doorway and try to pull me back to brighter places. He learned to be in the kitchen making coffee present but not pressing, and to meet me when I came back with the kind of steadiness that said, "I'm here," without requiring me to be anywhere other than where I was. And I learned to say, out loud, when I was struggling, because he needed me to use words. Not because he didn't read me well, he read me better than anyone, but because he needed to know I trusted him with the articulated version. He needed the words to be able to give me the things that words unlock. "I am sad today. I am missing her. I need you here." Simple sentences that cost me something and gave him something, and made the whole architecture of us stronger for being built with honesty as its material. We had our first argument about 3 months in. It was not dramatic. It was very us, which meant it was quiet and specific and about something concrete rather than the large formless things underneath. He had committed to something on a Saturday without checking with me first, something work-related that meant changing plans we had made, and I was more upset about it than the situation warranted, which told me it wasn't really about Saturday at all. I don't need you to check every plan with me, I said, but I need to matter in your decision-making, not as an afterthought, as an actual variable. He was quiet, processing. You're right, he said. And then, which was harder for him, I don't have a lot of practice building my life around someone else's. I've been doing everything alone for a long time. A pause. I'm going to get this wrong sometimes. I know, I said. I will too. I just need you to know I'm here. I know you're here, he said. And then, quietly, I didn't know how much I was counting on that until recently, which was as close to I love you as he got for a while, and honestly, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the sentence of a man who had built his whole life on not needing anyone, realizing that the structure he'd constructed had a load-bearing element he hadn't accounted for in the original plans. 6 months after the nursery, I made a decision. I made it slowly, the way all meaningful decisions are made, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of many smaller moments. Each one a small weight added to a scale until the balance tips and something that was uncertain becomes quietly certain. I wanted to try again, not the same way, not the same situation, not the same anything, but the desire to be a parent, which had been buried under grief and loss, and the specific exhaustion of having wanted something fiercely and had it taken, was still there. I could feel it the way you feel. Something under snow, the pressure of it, the shape under the surface. It had not dissolved. It was just waiting, with the particular patience of something that is part of who you are, rather than just something you want. I told Eric one evening, sitting on the floor of the nursery, which had become, somehow, the room we went to when we needed to say something true. Not the couch, not the kitchen, but the room with yellow walls and cloud lights, the room that had been built out of care. I want to look into it again, I said. Eventually, not now, but I want to know it's a door that's still open. He was sitting across from me, his back against the wall, and he was quiet for long enough that I started to fill the silence with all the reasonable caveats I could think of, that I understood if this was too much, that I wasn't asking him to commit to anything, that this was my thing, and I wasn't putting it on him. Do you want to do it together? I stopped. He was looking at me with the clear, direct attention he used for things that mattered to him, not tentative, not offered up for negotiation, but stated the way he stated the structural requirements of a building, a fact that had been carefully considered and was now being presented as such. It's a big thing, I said. You'd be. I know what I'd be. Eric. Yurik. Jimmy. He said my name with that weight, that particular weight. I've been building toward this for 6 months, or longer. I need you to let me say what I'm saying. I let him. I want to do it with you, he said. Whatever form it takes, whatever timeline, I want to be here for it, all of it. You're not saying this because you feel like you have to, because of everything that happened. No, very direct, no hedging. I'm saying it because I was already 3 steps into falling in love with your life and your choices and the way you're going to parent. And I realized somewhere around the time I was hanging cloud lights in that room that I wanted to be the person holding the other end of the string. I looked at him for a long time. You do love me, I said. Yes, he said, simply, like the word had been waiting for the right moment to leave him and had finally found it. You couldn't just say it 6 years ago? I couldn't find the words, so you showed up with a ladder. He looked at me steadily. Did it work? Completely, I said. The path forward was neither fast nor linear, which is the most honest thing I can say about it. We did not leap from that conversation on the nursery floor to parenthood in a clean, cinematic arc. Life doesn't do that. Or rather, life does do that in films, which is why people are often surprised by how slow and paperwork-heavy the actual business of living is. We did research. We had conversations with each other, with professionals, with Dara, who had opinions about everything and whose opinions were sometimes useful. We talked about what we wanted and what we were afraid of and what we were willing to do to build the thing we were trying to build. We argued sometimes and came back to the table and argued again and built, slowly, the kind of understanding that doesn't come from agreement but from the practice of working through disagreement with honesty. Eric, it turned out, had thoughts about parenting that were both more considered and more tender than I had expected, though perhaps I should have expected it from a man who builds spaces for people to live in. He talked about the importance of a child having room, physical room, emotional room, room to be who they were going to be rather than who you needed them to be. He talked about consistency and the way children build safety from it. He talked about his own father's pattern of moving them from place to place and the longing he'd carried for a place that simply stayed, and his quiet intention to be that for a child. I watched him talk about these things, and I felt something I can only describe as rightness. Not the rightness of things being perfect, but the rightness of things being true. This was the accurate shape of things. This was where I was supposed to be. 1 year after the nursery, we started the process again. Together, this time. Both of us, on the paperwork, in the meetings, in the particular hope and terror of wanting something this much and beginning again to reach for it. Let me tell you about the morning. Everything was confirmed. It was early spring, which felt appropriate in the way that spring feels appropriate for things beginning. Not because the world is obligated to arrange its symbolism helpfully, but because sometimes it does anyway, and this was one of those times. The air had that particular quality of spring mornings, cool and faintly sweet, the kind of morning where you open a window and feel like you're breathing something you've been needing without knowing you were short of it. We were both in my kitchen. Our kitchen, by that point, Eric had moved in 7 months earlier in the quietly inevitable way that things become official when they've been functionally true for a long time. One morning his toothbrush was there, and then most of his clothes. And then his books were on the shelf, and his coffee cup was in the cabinet, and his reading glasses were on the table, and we looked at each other and said basically in unison, "You live here." And he said, "Apparently," and we had pasta for dinner to celebrate. So we were in our kitchen that spring morning, and I was at the table with my coffee, and he was at the counter doing something involving toast, and the careful attention he gave to small tasks that shouldn't have required that much attention. But that was just how he was with things, fully present, even for toast. The call came at 8:12. I picked up and listened, and the words went in and my brain processed them, and I sat with what they meant for about 3 seconds before I looked up at Eric, who had turned from the counter because he had heard me go very still, the way I went still when something large was happening. I said, "Okay, thank you, we'll be in touch today." And I put the phone down. "Jimmy." His voice was careful. Ready for either thing, I could hear it. Ready for good and ready for not. The particular balance of someone who has learned to hope and brace at the same time. "We have a match," I said. The toast he was holding, he'd made it while I was on the phone, and I don't think he'd realized he was holding it, lowered slowly to the counter. "A match," he repeated. "Due in 14 weeks, I said. "A boy." I stopped. And then, "Do you want to know his name, the one we picked?" He crossed the kitchen, 4 steps, and then he was in front of me, and he put his hands on my face the way he rarely did, holding it like something precious. And he looked at me with the full force of everything he felt written in him so plainly that I understood completely, and finally, that he had always been saying it. Every bowl of soup, every fixed faucet, every cloud light, every measured wall, every piece of toast made while he listened for my voice on the phone. All of it had been the same sentence, just delivered in the language he had always been more fluent in than spoken words. "Tell me," he said. "Eli," I said. He nodded slowly. Once, twice. Something moved across his face. Not quite tears. Eric did not do tears particularly, but something adjacent, something soft and enormous that he didn't try to hide from me. "Eli," he said. "Hi," I said softly. "Eli Walker, Lester." He pressed his forehead to mine. We stood in the kitchen with the spring coming through the window and the toast cooling on the counter, and 14 weeks between us and everything we were becoming, and Eric Walker, who had never known how to say, "I love you," said it in the way he had always known how. He was simply, completely there. The day we brought Eli home, it rained. Not a hard rain, just the soft, gray, persistent kind that makes the world smell like earth and beginnings, that turns the windows opaque and makes the interior of wherever you are feel more like itself. We drove very carefully, which was almost entirely me. I was in the back seat with Eli in his car seat, who was sleeping with the extraordinary, serious concentration of a brand new person learning how to be in the world, and I spent the entire drive with one hand hovering near him and the other pressed against the window, watching the city pass in the rain. Anik drove. He always drove when I was too busy feeling things to be reliable behind a wheel, which had become more frequent since Eli arrived, and everything seemed to require the full capacity of my emotional operating system all at once. He didn't fill the silence. He turned the radio on low. Not the specific playlist he played the day we painted the nursery, but something with a similar quality, music that was doing its work in the background. And he drove carefully through the rain and let me be in the back seat watching our son sleep. When we got home, he carried the car seat up the 3 flights because I was carrying what felt like approximately everything I'd ever felt in my entire life, in my chest at once, and my arms might not have been reliable. He carried the car seat and I unlocked the door and we brought Eli home. The nursery was yellow. The cloud lights were on, turned low, making the room glow with something that looked almost exactly like I had always imagined the inside of safety would look, if safety were a visual quality. The crib was ready. The rug was soft underfoot. The shelving held the things we had collected over 14 weeks of preparation. The careful, hopeful accumulation of 2 people building toward something. Eric set the car seat down, and we both looked at Eli for a moment, who went on sleeping with his entire face doing the specific thing that newborn faces do, twitching through some internal weather we couldn't see but wanted to. "We made this," I said. "We made this," Eric agreed. I turned to look at him. He was watching Eli with the expression of a person who has just understood something they suspected for a long time but needed proof of. Satisfied and certain and slightly awed. "Hey," I said. He looked at me. "I love you," I said. Easy, no effort. 6 years of a sentence I'd been building, and this was just its natural form, the way a building is always the natural form of the plans made for it. He looked at me for a moment, this man who had been showing me his love for 6 years in every language except this one. And then, with the smile I had collected and cataloged and kept safe in some interior room of myself since the first year I knew him, "I love you," he said. First time, out loud. The actual words. Eli slept on, unbothered. The cloud lights turned slowly in the warmth of the room. Outside, the rain softened further into something that was almost silence. And the spring settled around the building with its yellow room and its new name and its 2 men who had taken the long way to arrive at the most direct thing. And I thought, this is what it was for. All of it. The 6 years, and the grief, and the painted walls, and the soup on the doorstep, and the ladder in the hall. All of it was for the weight of this moment, the specific gravity of being loved in exactly the right ways, by exactly the right person, and knowing it, and saying so. The cloud lights turned. Eli breathed. We stayed. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even 1 member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.